What would you do if a 12-year-old girl in grease-stained overalls walked up to a team of elite Navy SEALs and casually announced she could fix their $1 million M1A2 Abrams tank engine that had stumped military mechanics for 3 weeks? Grace Williams wasn't joking when she made that bold claim at Fort Valor, and what happened next would shake the foundations of military protocol forever. Because when this mechanic's daughter actually succeeded where decorated professionals had failed, it exposed a web of institutional prejudice, revealed a shocking connection to her late mother's classified military service, and forced a Pentagon general to make a decision that would either destroy careers or revolutionize how the military recognizes true talent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete of Tank Maintenance Bay 7 at Fort Valor, creating waves of heat that shimmered off the massive bulk of the disabled M1A2 Abrams tank. The 68-ton beast sat silent and imposing, its 120mm main gun pointed skyward like an accusation against the cloudless desert sky. For 3 weeks, this particular tank had been the bane of every mechanic, technician, and engineer on the base. Its engine would start, run for exactly 47 minutes, then shut down completely with no warning and no apparent cause. Staff Sergeant Ethan Ranger Brooks crouched beside the tank's rear engine compartment, his Navy SEAL uniform dark with sweat despite the early morning hour. At 34, Brooks had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan, a helicopter crash in Syria, and enough classified operations to fill a small library. But this mechanical puzzle was proving more frustrating than enemy fire. His weathered hands, scarred from years of handling explosives and weapons, now held a multimeter that displayed readings that made no sense according to every manual he'd consulted. "Any luck, Sergeant?" called Colonel Walter Thunder Adams as he approached from the motor pool office, his boots clicking against the concrete with military precision. The Armored Division commander was a man built like the tanks he supervised, broad-shouldered and imposing, with silver hair that caught the morning light, and eyes that had seen too many battlefield casualties to tolerate equipment failures in peacetime. Brooks straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag that had long since given up any pretense of cleanliness. "Negative, sir. Engine diagnostics show all systems normal. Fuel delivery is perfect. Electrical systems check out. But she still shuts down like clockwork after 47 minutes. It's like the tank is programmed to quit." Master Chief Anthony O'Brien emerged. From beneath the tank's massive chassis, his graying beard streaked with hydraulic fluid, and his expression bearing the frustrated look of a man who had spent 30 years coaxing machinery to work, and was now facing his first real defeat. "I've checked everything twice, Colonel. Powertrain, cooling system, fuel injection, computer modules. Hell, I even checked the air filters. This tank should be running like a Swiss watch." The maintenance bay buzzed with the controlled chaos of military efficiency. Soldiers moved between various vehicles in different stages of repair, their voices creating a steady backdrop of professional communication mixed with the occasional curse word directed at stubborn equipment. The smell of diesel fuel, hot metal, and industrial lubricants hung in the air like an invisible cloud, familiar and oddly comforting to anyone who had spent time around military machinery. Captain Benjamin Hall strode into the bay with the kind of confidence that came from graduating near the top of his class at West Point and never having encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through proper procedure and sufficient authority. At 29, he possessed the particular arrogance of someone who believed that rank and education were adequate substitutes for experience and intuition. His uniform was immaculate despite the desert heat, and his expression suggested that he viewed the tank's mechanical problems as a personal affront to his leadership abilities. "Gentlemen," Hall announced, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience, "I've just received word from Division Headquarters that this tank is needed for tomorrow's training exercise, whatever the problem. It needs to be fixed today." Brooks looked up from his diagnostic equipment with barely concealed irritation. "With respect, Captain, we've had every qualified mechanic on the base look at this machine. The engine runs perfectly for 47 minutes, then shuts down completely. No warning lights, no error codes, no gradual power loss. It just stops." "Perhaps you need to expand your definition of qualified mechanics," Hall replied with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've arranged for a civilian contractor to come in this afternoon, someone with advanced degrees in mechanical engineering." Master Chief O'Brien's expression darkened noticeably. "Sir, I've been working on tank engines since before that contractor was probably born. This isn't about education, it's about something we're missing." The tension in the maintenance bay was becoming palpable, with several nearby soldiers slowing their work to listen to the exchange between the seasoned NCOs and the young officer. It was a familiar dynamic in military settings, the eternal struggle between experience and authority, between practical knowledge and theoretical training. Colonel Adams stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding attention from everyone in the bay. "Captain Hall, I appreciate your initiative, but Master Chief O'Brien and Sergeant Brooks represent some of the finest mechanical expertise in the armed forces. If they say there's something unusual about this problem, I'm inclined to trust their assessment." From her position near the tool storage area, where she had been quietly organizing spare parts for her father, Grace Williams had been listening to the entire conversation with the focused attention of someone who understood that adult problems often had simpler solutions than adults were willing to consider. At 12 years old, she possessed the kind of mechanical intuition that couldn't be taught in schools or learned from manuals. A gift inherited from both her father and her late mother, who had served as a combat engineer before her death in an IED explosion 2 years earlier. Grace had been spending her summer days in the maintenance bay, partly because military families often had limited childcare options during school breaks, but mostly because she genuinely loved being around machinery. Her father, James Williams, was one of the base's most respected civilian mechanics, and he had been teaching her about engines and mechanical systems since she was old enough to hold a wrench safely. What most adults didn't realize was that Grace had already developed theories about the tank's problem based on 3 weeks of casual observation. James Williams emerged from the parts cage where he had been checking inventory, wiping his hands on coveralls that bore the stains and patches of 20 years working on military vehicles. He was a quiet man in his early 40s, with the kind of steady competence that made him invaluable to the motor pool, but often invisible to officers, who measured worth by rank rather than ability. The death of his wife Rebecca had left him raising Grace alone, while managing his own grief and the challenges of single parenthood in a military community. "Any progress on the Abrams?" James asked Master Chief O'Brien, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Same story, different day," O'Brien replied with evident frustration. "Runs perfect for 47 minutes, then dies like someone threw a switch." Grace looked up from the parts she had been sorting, her young face serious, with the kind of concentration that adults often mistook for daydreaming. "Has anyone checked the thermal relay in the engine control module?" she asked quietly. The conversation in the maintenance bay came to an abrupt halt. 6 experienced military personnel turned to stare at the 12-year-old girl who had just offered a technical suggestion about a $1 million piece of military hardware that had stumped them. For 3 weeks, Captain Hall was the first to recover, his expression shifting from surprise to condescending amusement. "I think the adults can handle this, young lady. Perhaps you should find somewhere else to play." Grace felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger, but she kept her voice steady. I wasn't playing, sir. I was observing. The tank runs for exactly 47 minutes every time, which suggests a thermal cutoff rather than a mechanical failure. If the thermal relay is miscalibrated, it would shut down the engine when it reaches a specific temperature threshold, even if that temperature is actually safe. Brooks looked at Grace with new interest, his SEAL training having taught him to evaluate information based on its merit rather than its source. That's actually a pretty sophisticated analysis. How did you come up with that? Because Mom and taught me that engines talk to you if you know how to listen, Grace replied, her hand unconsciously touching a small pendant she wore on a chain around her neck. Mechanical failures usually get worse over time, but this problem is too consistent. To be mechanical, it has to be electronic. James Williams stepped forward, his expression mixing pride in his daughter's intelligence with concern about her drawing attention to herself in a military environment that didn't always appreciate unconventional thinking. Grace has been around machinery her whole life, he explained to the group. Her mother was a combat engineer, and she taught Grace a lot about troubleshooting before. His voice trailed off, and everyone in the bay understood the implication. Military families lived with the constant awareness of loss, and the Williams family had paid that price. Master Chief O'Brien studied Grace with the appraising look of someone who had learned to recognize talent regardless of its packaging. The thermal relay is buried pretty deep in the engine control system. It's not something we routinely check unless we have a specific reason to suspect it. That's exactly why it could be the problem, Grace said with growing confidence. Sometimes the obvious things are obvious, and sometimes the obvious things are hiding underneath the complicated things. Colonel Adams found himself faced with an unusual decision. Military protocol suggested that a 12-year-old civilian should not be offering technical advice about classified equipment, but his 30 years of service had also taught him that good ideas could come from unexpected sources. The tank was needed for tomorrow's training exercise. Conventional approaches had failed, and the girl's reasoning actually made sense. How long would it take to check this thermal relay? He asked Master Chief O'Brien. Maybe an hour to access it and run diagnostics, O'Brien replied. Another hour to replace it if that turns out to be the problem. Captain Hall stepped forward, his expression showing clear disapproval of the direction the conversation was taking. Colonel, surely we're not going to base our maintenance decisions on suggestions from a child. What kind of precedent does that set? The question hung in the air like a challenge, highlighting the fundamental tension between institutional hierarchy and practical problem-solving that had existed in military organizations for centuries. In that moment, Grace Williams represented something that made many career officers uncomfortable, the possibility that expertise and insight weren't always distributed according to rank, age, or formal credentials. Brooks looked at Grace with the kind of respectful attention he usually reserved for fellow professionals. You really think it's the thermal relay? Grace nodded solemnly. It makes sense with all the symptoms, and if I'm wrong, you've only lost an hour checking something that probably should be checked anyway. The maintenance bay fell silent, except for the distant sounds of other equipment being worked on in adjacent areas. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something unusual, a moment where military hierarchy was being challenged not by insubordination or politics, but by the simple possibility that a 12-year-old girl might understand something that career professionals had missed. Colonel Adams made his decision with the kind of command authority that had earned him his rank. Master Chief, check the thermal relay. If the young lady is right, we'll have our tank ready for tomorrow's exercise. If she's wrong, we're no worse off than we are now. Captain Hall's expression darkened considerably. Sir, I must protest this decision. We're allowing a civilian child to direct military maintenance operations. The liability issues alone. My responsibility, Adams interrupted firmly. And right now, my responsibility is getting that tank operational. We'll follow proper documentation procedures regardless of who provides the diagnostic insight. As Master Chief O'Brien began gathering the tools needed to access the engine control module, Grace felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She had spent weeks watching the various attempts to fix the tank, and her suggestion represented the culmination of careful observation and intuitive understanding. But she also understood that if she was wrong, she would have wasted the time of some very important people and possibly embarrassed her father in front of his colleagues. James Williams approached his daughter, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. Are you sure about this, Grace? These folks have been working on this problem for a long time. Grace looked up at her father with the kind of quiet confidence that reminded him painfully of her mother. I'm sure, Dad, it's what Mom would have figured out if she was here. The reference to Rebecca Williams created another moment of silence in the maintenance bay. Several of the soldiers present had known her, and all of them understood the weight of loss that military families carried. Grace's suggestion wasn't just about solving a mechanical problem. It was about honoring the memory of a woman who had died serving her country and passing on the knowledge she had shared with her daughter. Brooks began helping Master Chief O'Brien prepare for the diagnostic procedure, but his attention kept returning to Grace. There was something about her confidence and technical reasoning that reminded him of someone, though he couldn't quite place the memory. As they worked to access the engine control module, he found himself wondering about the story behind this remarkable young girl and the mother who had taught her to listen to engines. The morning sun climbed higher in the Arizona sky, and the maintenance bay grew hotter, but the atmosphere was charged with the kind of anticipation that comes when long-standing problems might finally have solutions. Grace Williams had done something that military protocol didn't account for. She had offered expertise without regard for rank, age, or institutional hierarchy. Whether she was right or wrong, she had already changed the dynamic in tank maintenance. Bay 7, and everyone present sensed that something significant was about to happen. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The sound of power tools echoed through Tank Maintenance Bay 7 as Master Chief O'Brien began the delicate process of accessing the engine control module buried deep within the Abrams tank's mechanical systems. Grace Williams sat on an overturned supply crate nearby, her legs swinging slightly as she watched the procedure with the focused attention of someone who understood that mechanical work was equal parts knowledge and intuition. The morning heat was beginning to build, but the bay's industrial fans provided enough circulation to keep the workspace tolerable. Brooks positioned himself where he could observe both the diagnostic procedure and Grace's reactions, his SEAL training having taught him to gather information from multiple sources simultaneously. "So Grace," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "your mom taught you about engines?" Grace's hand moved unconsciously to the pendant at her throat, a small silver compass that had belonged to her mother. "She said that every machine has a personality, and if you pay attention long enough, you can learn to understand what it's trying to tell you." "That's an unusual way to think about mechanical systems," Brooks observed, genuinely interested in her perspective. "Mom said that most people try to force machines to work instead of listening to what's wrong with them," Grace replied. "She always told me that the best mechanics aren't the ones who know the most about fixing things. They're the ones who know the most about understanding things." James Williams smiled slightly at his daughter's words, recognizing Rebecca's philosophy in every syllable. His late wife had possessed an almost supernatural ability to diagnose mechanical problems, a talent that had made her invaluable to her combat engineering unit and had saved countless lives during her deployments. watching Grace demonstrate similar abilities was both a source of pride and a painful reminder of everything they had lost. Captain Hall stood near the maintenance bay entrance, his posture rigid with disapproval as he observed the proceedings. His phone buzzed with a text message, and his expression grew even more sour as he read it. "Colonel Adams," he called out, "I've just received word from Division Headquarters. General Taylor wants a status report on the tank repair by 1400 hours today." The mention of General Monica Taylor sent a subtle ripple of tension through the maintenance bay. The base's commanding officer was known for her direct communication style and her limited patience for excuses, regardless of how complicated the underlying problems might be. She had earned her position through a combination of battlefield competence and administrative skill, but she was also under constant pressure from Pentagon officials who measured success in terms of equipment, readiness, and budget efficiency. Colonel Adams checked his watch, noting that they had less than 4 hours to either fix the tank or prepare an explanation for why it remained inoperable. "How long to reach the thermal relay, Master Chief?" O'Brien's voice came from beneath the tank, slightly muffled by the engine compartment housing. "Maybe 30 minutes to get to it, another 10 to run the diagnostic. If the young lady is right, replacement should take about an hour, and if she's wrong," Captain Hall asked with barely concealed skepticism, "then we'll have eliminated one more possibility and learned something about the system," Brooks replied, before anyone else could respond. His tone carried the kind of calm authority that came from years of making decisions under pressure. In special operations, we're taught to evaluate intelligence based on its potential value, not just its source. Grace looked at Brooks with curiosity, recognizing something in his demeanor that reminded her of her mother's military bearing. "What kind of special operations do you do?" "The kind that involves a lot of problem-solving under difficult circumstances," Brooks answered diplomatically. "Your mother was combat engineering, right? That's serious business." "She cleared roads and bridges," Grace said quietly. "Made sure convoys could get through safely. She said her job was keeping people alive by making sure the paths were clear." The parallel between Rebecca Williams's military service and Grace's current attempt to clear the path to solving the tank's problems wasn't lost on anyone in the maintenance bay. Both involved identifying hidden dangers and finding solutions that others had missed, though the stakes and circumstances were vastly different. Corporal Diana Hughes entered the bay carrying a tablet loaded with technical manuals and diagnostic software. At 23, she was one of the youngest tank operators on the base, but her mechanical aptitude had earned her additional responsibilities in troubleshooting and maintenance support. Her presence in the armored division had initially been met with skepticism from some of the older soldiers, but her competence had gradually won over most of her critics. "Master Chief," Hughes called out, "I've got the complete service history for this tank loaded up. Maybe there's something in the maintenance records that could help." "Good thinking, Corporal," O'Brien replied from beneath the tank. "Check for any previous work on the engine control systems, especially anything involving temperature sensors or thermal management." Hughes began scrolling through months of maintenance records, her brow furrowed in concentration as she searched for patterns or anomalies that might provide clues about the current problem. Grace watched her work with interest, recognizing a kindred spirit in someone who approached problems systematically and thoroughly. "Corporal Hughes," Grace said hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" Hughes looked up from her tablet, surprised to be addressed directly by the 12-year-old. "Sure. What's up? How do you deal with people who don't think you belong here?" The question caught Hughes off guard, but she recognized the underlying concern that prompted it. "You mean because I'm young and female in a job that's usually done by older guys?" Grace nodded, glancing toward Captain Hall, who was making no effort to hide his disapproval of her involvement in the diagnostic process. Hughes set down her tablet and gave Grace her full attention. I guess I focus on doing the job really well and letting the results speak for themselves. Some people will always have problems with change, but most people eventually respect competence. Even when the competence comes in an unexpected package? Grace asked. Especially then, Hughes replied with a slight smile. The best soldiers I know are the ones who can adapt to new situations and recognize value wherever it appears. Brooks found himself studying the interaction between the young corporal and Grace, noting the natural mentorship that was developing between them. Military communities often functioned as extended families, with experienced personnel taking responsibility for guiding newcomers, regardless of their official relationships. Watching Hughes encourage Grace reminded him of similar moments in his own career when senior personnel had provided crucial support during challenging times. Master Chief O'Brien's voice interrupted the conversation. Got it! Thermal relays! Accessible. Grace, you want to come take a look at this? Grace slipped off her supply crate and approached the tank, peering into the engine compartment where O'Brien had exposed a small electronic component surrounded by complex wiring and cooling systems. The thermal relay looked unremarkable, just a metal box about the size of a deck of cards with several electrical connections. That's it? Grace asked, sounding slightly disappointed that such a small component could cause such a large problem. Sometimes, the biggest problems come from the smallest parts, O'Brien explained, positioning his diagnostic equipment to test the relay's functionality. Let's see what this little guy has been up to. The diagnostic process required several minutes of careful testing, with O'Brien checking electrical continuity, temperature thresholds, and response timing. Grace watched every step of the procedure with fascination, asking occasional questions that demonstrated her understanding of the underlying principles involved. Bingo, O'Brien announced suddenly, his voice carrying a mixture of satisfaction and amazement. Thermal cutoff is set at 92 degrees Celsius, but the relay is triggering at 87 degrees. 5-degree difference is enough to shut down the engine just as it reaches normal operating temperature. Colonel Adams stepped forward, his expression showing both relief and respect. So Grace was right? Dead on, O'Brien confirmed. This relay has been shutting down the engine every time it reaches what should be normal operating temperature. The engine isn't overheating, the safety system just thinks it is. Captain Hall's expression suggested that he was struggling to process the implications of a 12-year-old correctly diagnosing a problem that had stumped military professionals for 3 weeks. How could she possibly have known that? Brooks looked at Grace with genuine admiration. She didn't know it specifically, she just understood the pattern well enough to make an educated guess about the most likely cause. It's what Mom called thinking like the machine, Grace explained. Instead of thinking about what you want the machine to do, you think about what the machine is trying to do and why it might not be working. James Williams felt a surge of pride in his daughter's accomplishment, mixed with the familiar ache of wishing Rebecca could have been there to see it. His wife would have understood exactly how Grace had arrived at her conclusion, because she had taught their daughter to approach mechanical problems with the same intuitive intelligence that had made her such an effective combat engineer. Hughes looked up from her tablet with excitement. Master Chief, I found something in the maintenance records. This tank had engine control work done about 6 weeks ago. Looks like they replaced several temperature sensors, but didn't recalibrate the thermal relay. So the new sensors are more sensitive than the old ones, O'Brien mused, but the relay is still set for the old specifications. That would explain why the problem started recently and why it's so consistent. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with satisfying precision, but Grace found herself thinking about broader implications beyond just fixing one tank. If this happened because someone forgot to recalibrate the relay after replacing the sensors, couldn't the same thing happen to other tanks? Her question created a moment of silence in the maintenance bay, as everyone present realized that they might be looking at a systemic problem rather than an isolated mechanical failure, if similar work had been done on other vehicles without proper calibration procedures. There could be additional problems waiting to manifest. Colonel Adams immediately grasped the potential scope of the issue. Hughes, check the maintenance records for all Abrams tanks that had engine control work done in the past 2 months. I want to know if we're looking at a fleet-wide problem. Yes, sir, Hughes replied, already pulling up broader maintenance databases on her tablet. Captain Hall's phone rang, and he answered it with the crisp efficiency expected of a military officer. Captain Hall, yes, sir, I understand. Right away, sir. He ended the call and turned to address Colonel Adams. Sir, General Taylor wants to see you in her office immediately. Apparently, word about our unconventional diagnostic approach has reached base command. The atmosphere in the maintenance bay shifted noticeably as everyone realized that Grace's involvement in solving the tank problem had attracted attention from the highest levels of base leadership. General Taylor's reputation for directness meant that the conversation would likely focus on whether proper procedures had been followed and whether any regulations had been violated. Grace felt a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach as she realized that her attempt to help might have created problems for the adults who had listened to her suggestion. Military organizations operated according to strict hierarchies and established procedures, and her age and civilian status made her an anomaly that didn't fit neatly into official categories. Don't worry, Brooks said quietly, recognizing her concern. You've done nothing wrong. In fact, you've done something pretty remarkable. But I'm not supposed to be giving advice about military equipment, Grace replied, her voice smaller than it had been earlier. Says who? Brooks asked with a slight smile. I've never seen a regulation that specifies minimum age requirements for having good ideas. James Williams approached his daughter, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Grace, whatever happens next, I want you to know how proud I am of you today. Your mother would be proud too. Colonel Adams gathered his composure and prepared to face what would likely be a challenging conversation with General Taylor. Master Chief, how long to replace that relay and get the tank operational? Give me an hour, sir. Maybe 90 minutes if we run into complications. Do it, and document everything carefully. I have a feeling we're going to need detailed records of exactly how this problem was identified and resolved. As O'Brien began the process of replacing the faulty thermal relay, Grace found herself wondering whether she had helped solve a problem or created a much larger one. The tank would be fixed, but the questions about protocol, procedure, and institutional hierarchy were just beginning. Specialist Roberto Ortiz appeared in the maintenance bay doorway, his communications equipment crackling with radio traffic from around the base. Colonel Adams, sir. General Taylor's office just called. She wants the entire diagnostic team to report for debriefing as soon as the tank is operational. The term entire diagnostic team seemed to hang in the air with particular significance, as everyone present understood that it would include Grace. A 12-year-old civilian was about to be summoned to explain her role in solving a military maintenance problem to one of the most senior officers on the base. Brooks looked at Grace with an expression that mixed encouragement with concern. You ready for this? Grace straightened her shoulders in a gesture that reminded everyone present of her mother's military bearing. Yes, sir. I think so. Good, Brooks replied, because something tells me this is just the beginning. The sound of the M1A2 Abrams Tank roaring to life filled Tank Maintenance Bay 7 with a deep, powerful rumble that seemed to vibrate through the concrete floor and into the bones of everyone present. Master Chief O'Brien stood beside the massive machine with a satisfied expression, watching the engine temperature gauges climb steadily toward normal operating levels, without any sign of the premature shutdown that had plagued the tank for 3 weeks. 47 minutes and counting, O'Brien announced, checking his watch as the engine continued running smoothly. 50 minutes, 60 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, we have ourselves a properly functioning tank. Grace Williams felt a mixture of relief and pride as she watched the temperature readings stabilize exactly where they should be. Her diagnosis had been correct, but the knowledge brought with it an awareness that she was about to face questions from people who might not appreciate a 12-year-old solving problems that had stumped career professionals. Colonel Adams approached. The tank, with the measured pace of someone who had spent decades around military machinery, but still felt genuine satisfaction when complex problems received elegant solutions. Outstanding work, Master Chief. How long has it been running now? 93 minutes and holding steady, O'Brien replied. Engine temperature is exactly where it should be. All systems are showing normal parameters. This tank is ready for tomorrow's training exercise. Captain Hall stood near the maintenance bay entrance, his expression suggesting that he was struggling to reconcile his institutional expectations with the reality of what had just occurred. His phone had been buzzing intermittently with messages, and each notification seemed to deepen his obvious discomfort with the situation. Brooks watched Grace's reactions carefully, noting her mixture of satisfaction and growing nervousness as the implications of her success became clear. In his experience, solving problems often created new challenges, especially when the solutions challenged established assumptions about how things were supposed to work. "Grace," Brooks said quietly, "you understand what's about to happen, right?" Grace nodded solemnly. "General Taylor wants to know how a kid figured out something that all the adults missed." "That's part of it," Brooks confirmed. "But she's also going to want to understand whether this was just a lucky guess or if you actually know what you're talking about." "I know what I'm talking about," Grace replied with quiet confidence. "The question is whether she'll believe me." James Williams approached his daughter with the protective instincts of a father who understood that military hierarchies could be unforgiving to those who didn't fit conventional categories. "Grace, when we go to see General Taylor, just tell the truth about what you observed and how you reached your conclusion. Don't try to sound more knowledgeable than you are, but don't downplay what you actually know either." Corporal Hughes looked up from her tablet with an expression of concern and excitement. "Colonel Adams, I've found something important in the maintenance records. 7 other Abrams tanks on this base had similar engine control work done in the past 6 weeks. None of them had their thermal relays recalibrated." The implications of Hughes's discovery rippled through the maintenance bay like a shockwave. If Grace's analysis was correct, Fort Valor potentially had 8 tanks with the same problem, 7 of which hadn't experienced failures yet, simply because they hadn't been operated long enough or under the right conditions to trigger the miscalibrated safety systems. Colonel Adams immediately grasped the strategic significance of the information. "Hughes, I want you to prepare a complete analysis of those maintenance records. Check for any other vehicles that might have similar issues. This could affect our entire readiness status." "Yes, sir," Hughes replied, her fingers already moving across her tablet as she expanded her search parameters. Captain Hall's phone rang again, and this time his conversation was brief and clearly uncomfortable. "Colonel, General Taylor's office. She wants the diagnostic team in her office in 30 minutes. All of them." The phrase "all of them" carried particular weight, given that it included a 12-year-old civilian whose involvement in military maintenance operations existed in a gray area of regulations and protocols that most officers preferred not to navigate. Dr. Angela Scott appeared in the maintenance bay doorway, her arrival indicating that word of the unusual diagnostic situation had spread beyond the motor pool. As the base's senior military psychologist, Dr. Scott often became involved in situations that required careful handling of personnel issues or unusual circumstances that didn't fit standard operational procedures. Colonel Adams, Dr. Scott said, approaching the group with the measured professionalism that characterized her interactions with military personnel. I understand we have an interesting situation developing here. That's one way to put it, Adams replied carefully. Dr. Scott, meet Grace Williams. She's the one who identified the problem with our tank. Dr. Scott studied Grace with the kind of professional assessment that came from years of evaluating people under stress. Grace, I'm Dr. Scott. I work with families on the base to help navigate challenging situations. How are you feeling about all this attention? Grace considered the question seriously before answering. A little nervous, but mostly I just want people to understand that I was trying to help. And you did help, Dr. Scott assured her. The question now is how to make sure everyone understands that your contribution was valuable and appropriate. Brooks found himself increasingly impressed by Grace's composure under circumstances that would challenge many adults. Her ability to maintain focus on the technical problem while understanding the broader implications of her involvement suggested a level of maturity that went well beyond her chronological age. Dr. Scott, Brooks said, what's the protocol for situations like this? I mean, when civilians provide technical assistance on military equipment? Dr. Scott's expression suggested that she was navigating uncharted territory. Honestly, this is fairly unprecedented. We have procedures for contractor support and consultations with civilian experts, but those typically involve adults with formal credentials and security clearances. So what happens now? Grace asked, her voice smaller than it had been when she was discussing thermal relays and engine temperatures. Now we go explain to General Taylor exactly what happened and why it was the right thing to do, Colonel Adams said, with the kind of command authority that suggested he had already made his decision about how to handle the situation. Master Chief, O'Brien shut down the tank engine and began securing the maintenance bay for departure. Colonel, should I prepare a detailed technical report on the repair process? Absolutely. I want documentation of every step we took, every test we ran, and every decision we made. If this situation becomes a precedent for how we handle unconventional problem solving, I want the record to be absolutely clear. As the group prepared to leave the maintenance bay, Specialist Ortiz approached with his communications equipment active. Colonel Adams, I'm getting reports from other bases asking about our tank repair procedures. Apparently, word is spreading through military networks about our unique diagnostic approach. The realization that their local situation was attracting attention from beyond Fort Valor added another layer of complexity to an already unusual set of circumstances. Grace's technical insight was no longer just a local maintenance issue. It was becoming a case study in military problem solving that could influence policies and procedures across the entire armed forces. How many other bases are asking for information? Adams inquired. 4 so far, sir, and apparently someone at the Pentagon has requested a preliminary report on our maintenance protocols. Grace felt the weight of expanding attention like a physical presence. What had started as a simple observation about engine behavior was evolving into something much larger than she had anticipated or intended. Eleanor Williams appeared at the maintenance bay entrance, her silver hair reflecting the afternoon sunlight, and her expression showing the concerned determination of a grandmother who had spent decades navigating military communities. At 72, she possessed the kind of practical wisdom that came from raising children in multiple military assignments and understanding how institutions could both support and challenge families who didn't fit conventional patterns. "James," Eleanor called out, "I came as soon as I heard. How is Grace handling all this attention?" James embraced his mother briefly before turning to include Grace in the conversation. "She's holding up well, but she's about to meet with General Taylor to explain her role in fixing the tank." Eleanor studied her granddaughter with the appraising look of someone who understood both the opportunities and dangers that came with exceptional ability. "Grace, sweetheart, do you remember what your mother used to say about standing up for what you know to be true?" Grace nodded, her hand moving to touch the compass pendant at her throat. "She said that being right isn't always easy, but being wrong is always harder in the long run." "That's exactly right," Eleanor confirmed. "Your mother faced similar situations when people questioned her expertise because she was young or female or didn't fit their expectations. She always let her competence speak for itself." Brooks watched this family interaction with growing recognition that there was more to the Williams family story than he had initially understood. Something about the way they discussed Rebecca Williams's military service resonated with memories he couldn't quite bring into focus, creating a nagging sense that their paths had crossed in circumstances he hadn't yet remembered. Dr. Scott observed the family dynamics with professional interest, noting the strong support system that had helped Grace develop both her technical confidence and her emotional resilience. "Grace, when we meet with General Taylor, remember that you're not on trial. You're being asked to explain how you helped solve a problem, which is a very different thing." "What's the difference?" Grace asked. "Being on trial means people are looking for reasons why you were wrong," Dr. Scott explained. "Being asked to explain means people are looking for reasons why you were right." Colonel Adams checked his watch and gathered the group for the short walk to base headquarters. "People, we need to move. General Taylor doesn't appreciate lateness, and we've got some explaining to do." As they left Tank Maintenance Base 7, Grace took one last look at the Abrams tank that had started this entire sequence of events. The massive machine sat silent now, but she knew that tomorrow it would perform its assigned role in training exercises because she had listened to what it was trying to tell her about its problems. "Ready?" Brooks asked, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the administrative complex. "I think so," Grace replied. "Whatever happens, at least the tank is fixed." "That's true," Brooks agreed, "but something tells me that fixing the tank was just the beginning of this story." The Arizona sun beat down on the group as they made their way across the base, each person carrying their own concerns about the upcoming meeting with General Taylor. Behind them, Tank Maintenance Bay 7 stood empty, except for the sound of cooling metal and the lingering smell of diesel fuel. But the consequences of what had happened there were just beginning to unfold. As they approached the imposing facade of base headquarters, Grace realized that she was about to enter a world where her technical knowledge would be evaluated not just for its accuracy, but for its implications about military protocol, institutional hierarchy, and the complex question of who was qualified to solve problems in environments where the stakes were measured in lives rather than simply inconvenience. The glass doors of the administrative building reflected their small group back at them, and Grace saw herself walking between her father and Brooks, flanked by military professionals who had chosen to support her, despite the potential complications that her involvement might create for their own careers. Whatever General Taylor decided about her role in solving the tank problem, Grace understood that she had already learned something important about the kind of courage it took to recognize and support unconventional solutions to complex problems. 2. Air conditioning in General Monica Taylor's office provided a sharp contrast to the desert heat outside, but the atmosphere inside the spacious room felt charged with tension that had nothing to do with temperature. General Taylor sat behind an imposing mahogany desk that bore the accumulated paperwork of commanding a major military installation. Her silver hair pulled back in a regulation style that emphasized the steady gaze she directed at each person. Entering her office. At 52, General Taylor had earned her position through a combination of battlefield competence, administrative skill, and the kind of political awareness necessary to navigate the complex hierarchies of modern military organizations. She was the first woman to command Fort Valor, a distinction that made her acutely aware of how institutional precedents could either support or undermine future opportunities for non-traditional personnel. Grace Williams entered the office between her father and Colonel Adams, her small stature making her seem even younger in the formal military environment. The walls displayed commendations, unit citations, and photographs documenting decades of military service, creating an intimidating backdrop for what was essentially an interrogation of a 12-year-old's technical competence. "Please, everyone, take a seat," General Taylor said, her voice carrying the kind of controlled authority that made clear this was not a casual conversation. "Colonel Adams, I understand we have an unusual situation to discuss." Brooks positioned himself where he could observe both Grace and General Taylor, his SEAL training making him instinctively assess the dynamics of any potentially challenging situation. Dr. Scott sat beside Grace, her presence providing both professional support and a reminder that this meeting involved a child who deserved appropriate consideration regardless of her technical abilities. "General," Colonel Adams began, "3 weeks ago we had an M1A2 Abrams tank with an intermittent engine problem that had stumped our best mechanics and technicians. This morning, Grace Williams provided a diagnostic insight that led directly to identifying and fixing the problem." General Taylor's attention shifted to Grace with the kind of focused assessment that military officers typically reserved for evaluating personnel under their command. "Grace, is it? Tell me exactly what you observed about this tank problem." Grace straightened in her chair, her hand briefly touching the compass pendant at her throat before she began speaking. "The tank would run for exactly 47 minutes, every time before shutting down completely. That kind of consistency suggested an electronic safety system rather than a mechanical failure, because mechanical problems usually get worse over time or show more variation." "Go on," General Taylor prompted, her expression neutral but attentive. "I suggested checking the thermal relay in the engine control module," Grace continued, her voice growing stronger as she explained her reasoning. "If the relay was miscalibrated, it would shut down the engine when it thought the temperature was too high, even if the actual temperature was safe." General Taylor made notes on a legal pad as Grace spoke, her handwriting precise and economical. "And this suggestion proved correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Master Chief O'Brien interjected. "The thermal relay was set 5 degrees too low. It was shutting down the engine just as it reached normal operating temperature." Furthermore, Colonel Adams added, "Corporal Hughes discovered that 7 other tanks on this base had similar engine control work done recently without proper calibration. We potentially avoided a fleet-wide readiness problem." The information about additional affected tanks clearly caught General Taylor's attention, her expression shifting from routine inquiry to strategic concern. 7 other tanks. Are you telling me that one child's observation may have prevented multiple equipment failures? "That appears to be the case, General," Adams confirmed. Captain Hall, who had remained silent since entering the office, finally spoke up with obvious discomfort. "General Taylor, while the outcome was positive, I must express concern about the precedent we're setting by allowing civilian children to direct military maintenance operations." Grace felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger at being referred to as if she weren't present in the room, but she kept her expression neutral, as she had seen her mother do when facing similar dismissive attitudes. "Captain Hall raises a valid point about protocol," General Taylor acknowledged. "However, I'm more interested in understanding how this situation actually developed. Colonel Adams, walk me through the decision-making process." Adams straightened slightly, prepared to defend his choices. "General, we had exhausted conventional diagnostic approaches. When Grace offered a technically sound suggestion based on careful observation, I made the command decision to investigate her hypothesis. The alternative was continued equipment failure with no clear resolution path." Brooks found himself studying General Taylor's reactions, noting her careful attention to both the technical and procedural aspects of the situation. "General, if I may add something?" General Taylor nodded for him to continue. "In special operations, we're taught to evaluate intelligence based on its potential value, not just its source," Brooks said. "Grace's analysis was methodical, technically sophisticated, and ultimately correct. Those are the criteria that should matter." Dr. Scott leaned forward slightly, bringing her professional perspective to the discussion. "General Taylor, from a psychological standpoint, Grace demonstrates exceptional technical aptitude combined with mature reasoning skills. Her contribution wasn't random luck. It was the result of systematic observation and inherited knowledge." "Inherited knowledge?" General Taylor inquired. James Williams spoke for the first time since entering the office. "General, my late wife Rebecca was a combat engineer. She taught Grace about mechanical systems from an early age, emphasizing analytical thinking and systematic troubleshooting." The mention of Rebecca Williams caused an almost imperceptible shift in General Taylor's expression, though she maintained her professional composure. "Rebecca Williams. I remember that name. She served with distinction before her death in Afghanistan." "Yes, ma'am," James replied quietly. "Grace has inherited both her mother's technical intuition and her commitment to solving problems that help other people." General Taylor set down her pen and studied Grace with renewed attention. "Grace, do you understand why some people might be concerned about your involvement in military equipment maintenance?" Grace considered the question seriously before answering. "Because I'm young and civilian, and military organizations need to follow rules about who's qualified to work on important equipment." "That's exactly right," General Taylor confirmed. "So help me understand why you thought it was appropriate to offer technical advice in this situation." "Because people needed help, and I thought I might know something useful," Grace replied simply. "My mom always said that when you have knowledge that could help solve problems, you have a responsibility to share it." The room fell silent for a moment as everyone present absorbed the straightforward moral reasoning behind Grace's actions. Her motivation hadn't been to challenge military protocol or demonstrate her own abilities. It had been the simple desire to help solve a problem that was preventing people from doing their jobs effectively. Brooks felt a strange stirring of recognition as he listened to Grace's explanation, something about her reference to her mother's philosophy that seemed familiar in a way he couldn't quite identify. The nagging sense that he had encountered Rebecca Williams before continued to grow stronger, though the specific memories remained frustratingly elusive. General Taylor's phone buzzed with an incoming call, and she glanced at the display before declining the call. That was the third call from Pentagon officials in the past hour. Word about our unconventional diagnostic approach has reached some very senior levels of military leadership. Captain Hall's expression suggested that he viewed Pentagon attention as validation of his concerns about protocol violations. General, perhaps this situation illustrates exactly why we need to maintain strict adherence to established procedures. Or perhaps General Taylor replied thoughtfully. It illustrates why we need to be more flexible about recognizing valuable contributions, regardless of their source. Grace watched this exchange with growing understanding that her technical success had created a much larger conversation about institutional values and decision-making processes. The question was no longer whether she had been right about the thermal relay. The question was whether military organizations should create space for unconventional expertise when conventional approaches failed. Specialist Ortiz appeared in the office doorway with a folder of documents. General Taylor, I have the preliminary reports you requested. Also, 3 more bases have contacted us requesting information about our diagnostic procedures. General Taylor accepted the folder and quickly scanned its contents, her expression growing more serious as she read. Colonel Adams, according to these reports, similar thermal relay problems have been identified at installations across the country. We may be looking at a systemic issue affecting multiple bases. The implications of widespread equipment problems elevated the discussion far beyond local protocol concerns. If Grace's diagnostic insight had identified a pattern that affected military readiness at multiple installations, her contribution had strategic significance that transcended questions about age and credentials. How many installations are potentially affected? Adams asked. Based on preliminary data, possibly dozens, General Taylor replied, and all because maintenance protocols failed to account for the interaction between new temperature sensors and existing thermal relays. Grace felt overwhelmed by the expanding scope of what had started as a simple observation about one tank's behavior. She had never imagined that her suggestion could have implications for military operations beyond Fort Valor. Dr. Scott recognized Grace's reaction and provided gentle support. Grace, you should understand that discovering a widespread problem is actually a very good thing. It means we can fix all the affected equipment before it fails during critical operations. That's right, Brooks confirmed. In military operations, finding problems during peacetime is always better than discovering them when lives are at stake. General Taylor stood and walked to the window overlooking the base, her posture suggesting that she was weighing complex factors that went well beyond the immediate situation. Ladies and gentlemen, we have several issues to resolve. First, we need to address the immediate equipment problems at this base and coordinate with other installations to prevent further failures. Second, we need to determine how to handle the procedural questions raised by this situation. She turned back to face the group, her expression resolute. But before we address those larger issues, I want to say something directly to Grace. Grace straightened in her chair, uncertain what to expect from the base's commanding officer. Grace, what you did today demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical thinking and problem-solving ability that makes our military strong, General. Taylor said, your age and civilian status don't diminish the value of your contribution. In fact, they make it more remarkable. The unexpected praise left Grace speechless, and she felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes as she realized that General Taylor was taking her seriously as a person whose knowledge had value. However, General Taylor continued, we need to establish appropriate frameworks for how situations like this should be handled in the future. We can't have children wandering through maintenance bays offering technical advice, but we also can't afford to ignore valuable insights because they come from unexpected sources. Brooks found himself nodding in agreement with General Taylor's balanced assessment. Military organizations needed both structure and adaptability. The challenge was finding ways to maintain necessary discipline while remaining open to innovation and unconventional solutions. The general's phone rang again, and this time she answered it. General Taylor, yes, sir, I understand. We're prepared to provide a full briefing. Tomorrow morning is acceptable. Yes, sir. She ended the call and addressed the group with evident seriousness. That was the Pentagon. Major General Timothy Hayes will be arriving tomorrow to conduct a formal review of our maintenance protocols and decision-making processes. Everything that happened today will be subject to his evaluation. The news of a Pentagon review created a new level of tension in the room, as everyone present understood that their careers and reputations would be scrutinized by officials who might not appreciate unconventional approaches to military problems. Grace felt responsible for creating difficulties for people who had supported her, and her distress was evident in her expression. General Taylor, I don't want anyone to get in trouble because they listened to me. General Taylor returned to her desk and sat down, her demeanor becoming more formal as she prepared to address the official aspects of their situation. Grace, in military organizations, leaders are responsible for the consequences of their decisions. Colonel Adams chose to investigate your suggestion because he believed it had merit. That was his decision to make, and he'll be accountable for it, as will I, General Taylor added, because I'm about to make the decision to formally commend everyone involved in solving this problem, regardless of what Pentagon officials might think about our methods. The Officers' Club at Fort Valor rarely hosted such an unusual gathering. What had begun as an informal debriefing after the meeting with General Taylor had evolved into something approaching a strategy session, with military personnel from different branches and specialties united by their shared involvement in an increasingly complex situation. The evening light streaming through the club's windows cast long shadows across tables where coffee cups and official documents competed for space. Grace Williams sat between her father and Dr. Scott, feeling simultaneously included and overwhelmed by the adult conversation swirling around her. The day had transformed her from an anonymous mechanic's daughter into the center of a controversy that seemed to grow larger with each passing hour. Her notebook lay open on the table, filled with sketches and technical notes that had somehow become evidence in a debate about military innovation and institutional change. Brooks studied the room's occupants with the tactical awareness that defined his approach to complex situations. Master Chief O'Brien was explaining thermal relay specifications to Corporal Hughes, who was documenting everything for the formal report they would need to prepare for Major General Hayes. Colonel Adams sat slightly apart from the group, his phone buzzing intermittently with calls from other military installations requesting information about their diagnostic procedures. 7 bases have confirmed similar problems, Adams announced after ending his latest call. 3 more are conducting inspections based on our findings. The scope of this issue is expanding by the hour. Captain Hall occupied a corner table, his isolation from the main group reflecting his continued discomfort with the entire situation. His repeated attempts to contact Pentagon officials had yielded frustrating responses, suggesting that higher authorities were more interested in results than procedural concerns, a development that clearly challenged his expectations about institutional priorities. Eleanor Williams entered the Officers' Club with the measured pace of someone who had spent decades navigating military social environments. At 72, she possessed the kind of perspective that came from watching military families adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their core values and commitments. Her presence immediately drew Grace's attention, providing a calming influence in an environment that had become increasingly stressful. "How is our young engineer holding up?" Eleanor asked, settling into a chair beside her granddaughter. "I'm okay, Grandma," Grace replied, though her voice carried traces of the exhaustion that comes from being the center of intense adult attention for an entire day. "Everyone keeps asking me to explain things I thought were obvious," Eleanor smiled knowingly. "That's because what's obvious to you isn't obvious to most people. Your mother had the same gift for seeing solutions that others missed." The mention of Rebecca Williams created a moment of quiet in their immediate area, though conversations continued at other tables throughout the club. Brooks found himself listening more intently whenever Grace's mother was mentioned, the nagging sense of familiarity continuing to grow stronger without crystallizing into specific memories. Dr. Scott observed the family interaction with professional interest, noting how Eleanor's presence immediately reduced Grace's visible stress levels. Military families often developed sophisticated support systems to help their members navigate challenging circumstances, and the Williams family clearly possessed those kinds of resilient relationships. "Grace," Dr. Scott said gently, "how are you feeling about tomorrow's meeting with Major General Hayes?" Grace considered the question seriously before answering. "Nervous, but also curious. I want to understand why people think there's something wrong with solving problems when you have the knowledge to help." "There's nothing wrong with solving problems," Brooks assured her. "The concern is about maintaining proper procedures and ensuring that military equipment is only serviced by qualified personnel." "But what makes someone qualified?" Grace asked with genuine curiosity. "Is it age, or education, or experience, or understanding how things work?" The question struck at the heart of the controversy that had developed around her involvement in the tank repair. Traditional military thinking emphasized formal credentials and established hierarchies, but Grace's success challenged those assumptions by demonstrating that technical competence could exist independently of conventional qualifications. James Williams watched his daughter navigate these complex questions with a mixture of pride and concern. "Grace, remember that military organizations have rules for good reasons. People's lives depend on equipment working properly, so there have to be systems in place to ensure that maintenance is done correctly." "I understand that, Dad," Grace replied. "But if the systems aren't working to solve problems, shouldn't there be ways to adapt them?" Sergeant First Class Sofia Ramirez approached their table with the confident bearing of someone who had spent years bridging gaps between enlisted personnel and commissioned officers. At 38, she had earned respect throughout Fort Valor for her ability to translate between different levels of military hierarchy while maintaining focus on mission accomplishment. "Mind if I join you?" Ramirez asked, settling into an empty chair without waiting for permission. "I've been following this situation with considerable interest." "What's your take on it, Sergeant?" Brooks inquired, recognizing a kindred spirit in someone who understood institutional dynamics from a practical perspective. "I think we're looking at a classic case of the military's biggest challenge," Ramirez replied. "How do you maintain necessary discipline and structure while staying flexible enough to recognize and utilize talent wherever it appears?" Grace looked at Ramirez with curiosity. "Have you seen situations like this before?" "Different circumstances, same underlying tension," Ramirez confirmed. "I've watched brilliant enlisted personnel get ignored by officers who couldn't see past rank insignia, and I've seen innovative solutions get rejected because they didn't come through proper channels." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Private Danny Foster, whose young face showed the kind of excitement that came from being peripherally involved in something significant. At 19, Foster represented the newest generation of military personnel, those who had grown up with technology and collaborative problem-solving approaches that differed from traditional hierarchical models. "Sergeant Ramirez," Foster said breathlessly, "I just heard from my buddy at Fort Carson. They found the same thermal relay problem on 6 tanks, and they're crediting Fort Valor with identifying the issue. The news that their work was having immediate practical benefits at other installations provided tangible validation for Grace's contribution, but it also emphasized the expanding attention that would focus on tomorrow's review with Major General Hayes." Colonel Adams ended another phone call and approached their table with an expression that mixed satisfaction with growing concern. That was Fort Bragg. They've identified thermal relay issues on 12 tanks and want to send a technical team here to observe our diagnostic procedures. How many installations are affected now? Dr. Scott asked. At least 15, possibly. More, Adams replied. This has become an army-wide maintenance issue, which means tomorrow's review isn't just about our procedures. It's about whether our approach should become standard protocol for similar problems. Grace felt the weight of institutional attention settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. What had started as a simple observation about one tank's behavior had evolved into a case study that could influence military maintenance procedures across the entire armed forces. Brooks watched Grace's reaction with growing concern for her emotional well-being. Military personnel were trained to handle institutional pressure, but she was a 12-year-old civilian who had never asked to become the center of a policy debate about innovation and tradition in military organizations. Grace, Brooks said, quietly, do you understand what's really happening here? Grace nodded slowly. People are arguing about whether the military should change how it does things based on what I figured out about the tank. That's right, Brooks confirmed. And tomorrow, a very senior general is going to evaluate whether those changes should be implemented broadly, or whether this situation represents a dangerous departure from established procedures. Eleanor Williams placed a protective hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. Grace, whatever happens tomorrow, remember that you did the right thing for the right reasons. Your mother would be proud of how you've handled yourself today. The reference to Rebecca Williams triggered another wave of recognition in Brooks's memory, this time accompanied by fragments of specific details that seemed tantalizingly close to forming a complete recollection. Something about Afghanistan. A convoy, an explosion, and a combat engineer who had saved his life under circumstances he had tried not to remember. Mrs. Williams, Brooks said carefully, can you tell me more about your daughter-in-law's service? What unit was she with in Afghanistan? Eleanor's expression became more guarded, reflecting the instinctive caution that military families developed about sharing operational details. She was with the 84th Engineer Battalion, specializing in route clearance and explosive ordnance disposal. Why do you ask? The unit designation hit Brooks like an electric shock, bringing with it a flood of memories that he had successfully suppressed for nearly 3 years. The 84th Engineers, Route Tampa, an IED that should have killed him and his entire team, and a female combat engineer who had risked her life to extract them from a vehicle that was literally falling apart around them. Sergeant Rebecca Williams, Brooks said quietly, the name emerging from memories he had buried beneath layers of operational focus and deliberate forgetfulness. She pulled my team out of a burning MRAP after we hit a double-stacked IED en route Tampa. The officers' club seemed to grow silent around their table as Brooks's words registered with the Williams family. Grace stared at him with wide eyes, while James and Eleanor exchanged glances that reflected both recognition and old grief. You were there? Grace asked in a whisper. You knew my mom? Brooks nodded slowly, his professional composure cracking slightly as suppressed memories demanded acknowledgement. She saved 6 lives that day, including mine. We were trapped in an overturned vehicle with fuel leaking everywhere, and she crawled into that death trap to get us out one by one. James Williams found his voice first. She never told us the details about that operation, just said she'd helped some SEALs who had gotten into trouble. She did more than help us, Brooks replied, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to express. She performed one of the most courageous rescues I've ever witnessed, under conditions that would have killed most people. Grace, felt tears beginning to flow as she realized that the Navy SEAL who had supported her throughout this difficult day was someone her mother had risked her life to save. The connection seemed too profound to be coincidental, as if events had aligned to bring together people whose lives had been touched by Rebecca Williams' courage and sacrifice. "Is that why you believed in me?" Grace asked. "Because of what my mom did?" Brooks considered the question seriously before answering. "I believed in you because your analysis was sound and your reasoning was logical. But knowing about your mother's courage helps me understand where you got the strength to speak up when you knew you were right." The emotional revelation transformed the atmosphere at their table from professional concern to something more personal and complex. Grace's technical achievement was no longer just about fixing a tank or challenging institutional procedures. It was about honoring the legacy of a woman who had embodied the values of service and sacrifice that defined military communities at their best. Sergeant Ramirez observed the family reunion with the kind of understanding that came from witnessing how military service created unexpected connections between people separated by time and circumstance. "It sounds like courage runs in the Williams family, along with mechanical intuition and stubborn determination to help people," Eleanor added with a slight smile. As the evening light faded outside the officers' club, Grace found herself thinking about her mother in new ways. Rebecca Williams hadn't just been a combat engineer who had died serving her country. She had been someone whose courage had directly saved the life of the Navy SEAL, who was now supporting Grace through her own challenging situation. "Tomorrow's going to be interesting," Brooks said quietly, his perspective on the upcoming review fundamentally changed by the knowledge of his connection to Grace's family. "Yes, it is," Grace agreed, her hand touching the compass pendant that had belonged to her mother. "But at least now I understand why you've been helping me. You're returning a favor." Brooks shook his head gently. "No, Grace, I'm not returning a favor. I'm recognizing the same qualities in you that made your mother extraordinary. And tomorrow, I'm going to make sure Major General Hayes understands that those qualities deserve respect and support, regardless of institutional protocol." The morning sun cast stark shadows across the tarmac at Fort Valor as a sleek military transport aircraft touched down with the precision that characterized all Pentagon operations. Major General Timothy Hayes emerged from the aircraft with the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most senior officer in any room, his uniform immaculate despite the early hour, and his expression suggesting that he viewed this inspection as a necessary but unwelcome interruption to more important duties. Grace Williams stood beside her father at the edge of the airfield, watching the arrival of the man who would determine whether her involvement in solving the tank problem represented innovative thinking or dangerous deviation from military protocol. At 55, Major General Hayes possessed the kind of career-long institutional authority that could either validate unconventional approaches or crush them beneath the weight of regulatory compliance. Brooks positioned himself where he could, observe both the arriving inspection team and Grace's reactions, his protective instincts heightened by the knowledge of his connection to her mother. The previous evening's revelation had transformed his perspective on the entire situation, changing his role from professional observer to someone with a personal stake in ensuring that Grace received fair treatment from military authorities. "Remember what we discussed," Dr. Scott said quietly to Grace as they watched the Pentagon delegation organize itself for the short drive to base headquarters. "Answer questions directly and honestly, explain your reasoning clearly, and don't let anyone make you feel that your contribution was inappropriate." General Taylor approached the reception group with Colonel Adams and the other personnel who would participate in the formal review. Her expression reflected the controlled tension of someone who understood that her own career might be influenced by how effectively she defended the decisions made by her subordinates. "Grace," General Taylor said, her voice carrying both encouragement and subtle warning, "Major General Hayes is going to ask you detailed questions about your diagnostic process. He's not trying to intimidate you, but he needs to understand exactly how you reached your conclusions." Grace nodded solemnly, her hand briefly touching the compass pendant that had belonged to her mother. "General Taylor, what happens if he decides that I shouldn't have been involved in fixing the tank? Then we'll deal with whatever consequences arise," General Taylor replied firmly. "But you should understand that your contribution has already prevented equipment failures at multiple installations. Whatever Major General Hayes decides about protocol, the practical value of your work is undeniable." The convoy of military vehicles carrying the Pentagon inspection team pulled up to the base headquarters building with the kind of precise timing that characterized high-level military operations. Major General Hayes emerged from the lead vehicle and surveyed his surroundings with the appraising gaze of someone who had spent decades evaluating military installations and their personnel. Captain Hall stepped forward to provide the ceremonial greeting expected when senior officials visited subordinate commands, his relief at Pentagon involvement obvious in his demeanor. "Major General Hayes, welcome to Fort Valor. Captain Benjamin Hall, liaison officer for this inspection." Hayes acknowledged the greeting with minimal courtesy before turning his attention to General Taylor. "General, I understand we have a situation that requires clarification regarding maintenance protocols and civilian involvement in military operations." "Yes, sir," General Taylor replied. "We're prepared to provide a complete briefing on the events leading to the successful resolution of our equipment problems." As the group moved toward the conference room where the formal review would take place, Grace found herself walking between Brooks and her father, drawing strength from their supportive presence while trying to prepare mentally for questions that would determine how military organizations might approach similar situations in the future. The conference room had been arranged with the formal precision expected for high-level military meetings, complete with prepared briefing materials, technical documentation, and visual aids that would help explain the complex sequence of events that had led to Grace's involvement in the tank repair. The American flag and various unit colors provided a backdrop that emphasized the institutional significance of the proceedings. Major General Hayes took his position at the head of the conference table with the automatic authority that came from decades of command experience. His aide, a young colonel who seemed to exist primarily to take notes and manage logistics, arranged documents with efficient precision, while Hayes surveyed the assembled personnel with obvious skepticism. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes began, his voice carrying the kind of formal authority that made clear this was an official investigation rather than a casual inquiry. "I'm here to evaluate a situation that has attracted attention at the highest levels of military leadership. Specifically, the involvement of civilian personnel in diagnosing and repairing critical military equipment." Grace felt her stomach tighten with nervousness as she realized that Major General Hayes had already framed the situation in terms that emphasized protocol violations rather than successful problem-solving. His tone suggested that he viewed her involvement as an irregularity to be corrected, rather than an innovation to be understood. "General Taylor," Hayes continued, "please provide a chronological account of the events that led to this unconventional Diagnostic approach. General Taylor stood and activated the presentation system, displaying technical diagrams and maintenance records that documented the 3-week history of the tank's problems. Sir, we had an M1A2 Abrams tank with an intermittent engine failure that had stumped our most experienced mechanics and technicians. The tank would operate normally for exactly 47 minutes before shutting down completely with no apparent cause. And your maintenance personnel were unable to identify the problem? Hayes inquired, his tone suggesting that he found such technical incompetence difficult to believe. Master Chief O'Brien spoke up from his position at the table. Sir, we checked every conventional system multiple times. Engine diagnostics showed normal parameters, fuel delivery was perfect, electrical systems tested correctly. The consistency of the failure pattern was the only clue we had. Which brings us to the involvement of civilian personnel, Hayes said, his attention shifting to Grace with an intensity that made her feel like she was under a microscope. Miss Williams, I understand you provided the diagnostic insight that solved this problem. Grace straightened in her chair, drawing on the inner strength that she had inherited from her mother, along with her technical intuition. Yes, sir. I suggested checking the thermal relay in the engine control module because the timing of the shutdowns indicated an electronic safety system rather than a mechanical failure. And what qualified you to make such a diagnosis? Hayes asked bluntly. The question hung in the air like a challenge, highlighting the fundamental tension between institutional credentials and practical knowledge that had defined the entire controversy. Grace understood that her answer would either validate her contribution or expose her to criticism about exceeding her authority. My mother taught me about mechanical systems, Grace replied quietly but firmly. She said that engines talk to you if you know how to listen, and that consistent problems usually have electronic causes rather than mechanical ones. Your mother, Hayes repeated, consulting his notes. Sergeant Rebecca Williams, deceased, combat engineer with the 84th Engineer Battalion. The clinical way that Hayes referred to her mother's death created a moment of tense silence in the conference room. Grace felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she maintained her composure as she had watched her mother do when facing challenging situations. Brooks found himself unable to remain silent in the face of Hayes's dismissive tone regarding Rebecca Williams's service and sacrifice. Sir, with respect, Sergeant Williams was one of the most courageous and technically competent combat engineers I've ever encountered. She saved my life and the lives of 5 other SEALs during a route clearance operation in Afghanistan. Hayes turned his attention to Brooks with obvious displeasure at being interrupted. Sergeant Brooks, while I'm sure you appreciate Sergeant Williams's service, personal gratitude doesn't qualify her daughter to direct military maintenance operations. Actually, sir, Brooks replied, his voice carrying the controlled intensity that characterized his approach to situations where his values were challenged. Technical competence and sound reasoning qualify her to contribute to problem-solving efforts. The fact that she was right about the diagnosis seems to support that assessment. The exchange between Brooks and Hayes created a palpable tension in the conference room, as everyone present recognized that they were witnessing a fundamental disagreement about how military organizations should evaluate and utilize expertise. From unconventional sources, Dr. Scott stepped forward to provide a different perspective on the situation. Major General Hayes, from a psychological standpoint, Grace demonstrates exceptional analytical abilities combined with inherited knowledge from a parent who was highly skilled in technical problem solving. Her contribution wasn't random or irresponsible. It was the result of systematic observation and logical reasoning. Dr. Scott, Hayes replied impatiently, psychological evaluations don't address the regulatory and liability issues raised by allowing civilians to direct military Maintenance operations. We have established procedures for equipment servicing precisely because lives depend on proper function. Colonel Adams recognized that the review was moving in a direction that could result in disciplinary action against everyone who had supported Grace's involvement in the tank repair. Sir, if I may clarify the decision-making process that led to investigating Grace's suggestion. Hayes nodded curtly for Adams to continue. We had exhausted conventional diagnostic approaches without success, Adams explained. When Grace offered a technically sound hypothesis based on careful observation, I made the command decision to investigate her suggestion as one more diagnostic possibility. The alternative was continued equipment failure with potential impact on training operations and unit readiness. And you didn't consider the precedent you were setting by allowing a 12-year-old civilian to influence military maintenance decisions, Hayes asked sharply. I considered the potential value of solving a problem that was affecting our operational capabilities, Adams replied firmly. Leadership sometimes requires making decisions that don't fit perfectly within established parameters. Grace watched this exchange with growing understanding that the adults who had supported her were putting their own careers at risk to defend her contribution to solving the tank problem. The knowledge that people like Colonel Adams and Brooks might face professional consequences because they had listened to her suggestions made her feel both grateful and guilty. Corporal Hughes spoke up from her position at the conference table, her youth and relative inexperience making her intervention particularly notable. Sir, if I may add something about the technical aspects of this situation. Hayes gestured for her to continue, though his expression suggested limited patience for additional complications to what he clearly viewed as a straightforward regulatory matter. Grace's diagnosis identified a systematic problem that affected multiple installations, Hughes said, consulting her tablet. 22 bases have now confirmed similar thermal relay issues, with over 80 tanks potentially affected. Her insight prevented equipment failures that could have compromised training operations and unit readiness across the entire Army. The scope of the problem that Grace had identified clearly caught Hayes's attention, his expression shifting from regulatory concern to strategic awareness as he realized the institutional implications of the situation. 80 tanks? Hayes inquired, his tone suggesting that he was beginning to understand the practical significance of Grace's contribution beyond the procedural questions it had raised. Yes, sir, Hughes confirmed, and the problem was completely predictable. Once we understood the interaction between new temperature sensors and existing thermal relay calibrations, Grace's diagnostic approach has become the standard protocol for identifying similar issues. Major General Hayes sat back in his chair, his expression reflecting the kind of complex calculation that senior military officers made when balancing regulatory compliance with practical results. The knowledge that Grace's unconventional involvement had prevented widespread equipment failures complicated his evaluation of whether proper procedures had been followed. Miss Williams, Hayes said, his tone becoming less confrontational and more curious, do you understand the implications of what you've accomplished? Grace considered the question seriously before answering. I think I helped solve a problem. That was bigger than just one tank, and maybe showed that good ideas can come from people who don't fit the usual categories. The simple wisdom of her response created another moment of silence in the conference room, as everyone present absorbed the profound implications of a 12-year-old's perspective on institutional innovation and change. Hayes made notes on his legal pad for several minutes before looking up to address the assembled group. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a complex situation that requires careful consideration of both regulatory compliance and practical results. I'm going to recess this review for 1 hour while I consult with Pentagon officials about the appropriate response to these circumstances. As Major General Hayes left the conference room with his aide, Grace found herself surrounded by the adults who had supported her throughout this challenging process. Whatever decision emerged from his consultations with higher authorities, she had already learned something important about the kind of courage it took to defend unconventional solutions to complex problems. Brooks placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Whatever happens next, Grace, you've already honored your mother's legacy by using your knowledge to help people. Grace nodded, her hand touching the compass pendant that connected her to Rebecca Williams' memory and values. I just hope I haven't gotten everyone else in trouble for believing in me. That's not your responsibility, General Taylor assured her. We made our choices based on professional judgment, and we'll stand by those decisions regardless of the outcome. Outside the conference room windows, the Arizona sun continued its relentless climb toward midday, but inside the building, everyone waited to learn whether Grace Williams' remarkable contribution to military problem-solving would be celebrated as innovation or condemned as dangerous deviation from established protocol. The 1 hour recess stretched into an anxious waiting period that felt considerably longer to everyone involved in the review. Grace Williams sat in the base library with her father and Dr. Scott, trying to focus on a book about mechanical engineering, while her mind churned with worry about the consequences her involvement might create for the military personnel who had supported her. Through the library windows, she could see Major General Hayes pacing outside the headquarters building while speaking intensely into his phone. Brooks found himself walking the perimeter of the base, a habit he had developed during his SEAL training for managing stress and maintaining focus during uncertain situations. His conversation with Pentagon officials the previous evening had revealed that the thermal relay problem Grace identified was even more widespread than initially reported, with implications that extended far beyond Fort Valor's maintenance procedures. In the officers' club, Colonel Adams sat with Master Chief O'Brien and Sergeant Ramirez, reviewing the technical documentation they had prepared to support their decision-making process. Each of them understood that their careers could be significantly impacted by Hayes's final assessment, but none expressed regret about their choice to investigate Grace's diagnostic hypothesis. 28 years of service, O'Brien mused, studying the thermal relay specifications that had become the center of an institutional controversy. Never thought I'd see my career evaluated based on whether I listened to a 12-year-old's technical advice. The age isn't what matters, Ramirez replied firmly. What matters is that she was right, and we were smart enough to recognize it. Adams nodded agreement while checking his phone for updates from other installations that had implemented Grace's diagnostic approach. 43 bases have now confirmed the problem exists in their equipment. Whatever Hayes decides about our procedures, Grace's insight has prevented a massive readiness crisis. Captain Hall sat alone at a corner table, his isolation reflecting his continued discomfort with the entire situation. His attempts to position himself as the defender of proper procedure had been complicated by the undeniable practical benefits of Grace's contribution, leaving him in the awkward position of arguing against success while advocating for compliance. Eleanor Williams arrived at the base library carrying a thermos of coffee and the kind of calm determination that characterized military families who had weathered numerous institutional challenges. Her presence immediately provided comfort to Grace, who had been struggling to concentrate on anything other than the pending decision about her role in the tank repair. "How are you holding up, sweetheart?" Eleanor asked, settling into a chair beside her granddaughter. "I keep thinking about all the people who might get in trouble because they believed I could help," Grace replied quietly. Maybe I should have kept my idea to myself. Absolutely not, Eleanor said firmly. Your mother faced similar situations when people questioned her expertise because she didn't fit their expectations. She always said that staying silent when you have knowledge that could help people is a form of cowardice. Dr. Scott observed the family interaction with professional interest, noting how Eleanor's words seemed to strengthen Grace's resolve. Military families often developed sophisticated support systems that helped their members navigate challenging institutional situations, and the Williams family clearly possessed those kinds of resilient relationships. James Williams looked up from the maintenance manual he had been reviewing to provide additional perspective on their situation. Grace, whatever Major General Hayes decides, you need to understand that you did everything right. You observed a pattern, formed a hypothesis, and shared your analysis with people who were in a position to evaluate it. But what if they decide that children shouldn't be allowed to help with military equipment? Grace asked. Then the military will have made a policy decision that prioritizes procedure over results, James replied. But that decision won't diminish the value of what you accomplished. Meanwhile, in the headquarters building, Major General Hayes concluded his third phone conversation with Pentagon officials and returned to the conference room where his aide had been organizing the extensive documentation related to the thermal relay problem. The scope of the issue had grown considerably during their recess, with new reports arriving hourly from installations across the country. Sir, the aide reported, we now have confirmed problems at 47 installations involving 136 tanks. The cost of potential equipment failures would have exceeded $50 million, not including the impact on training operations and unit readiness. Hayes studied the growing list of affected installations with the kind of strategic awareness that characterized his approach to complex military problems, and all of this was identified based on the diagnostic approach developed by a 12-year-old civilian. Yes, sir. Her analysis of the timing patterns and electronic versus mechanical failure signatures has become the standard protocol for identifying similar problems. The practical implications of Grace's contribution were becoming impossible to ignore, even for someone who had initially focused primarily on regulatory compliance. Hayes found himself forced to weigh procedural concerns against results that had prevented a significant degradation of military readiness. His phone rang again, displaying the direct number for the Secretary of the Army. Hayes answered immediately, his posture straightening automatically as he prepared to brief one of the most senior officials in military leadership. Major General Hayes. Yes, sir, I'm conducting the review now. The scope is considerably larger than initially reported. Yes, sir, the diagnostic approach originated from civilian input. I understand, sir. A comprehensive recommendation by end of business today. Hayes ended the call and sat quietly for several minutes, understanding that his decision would establish precedent for how military organizations approached unconventional expertise in problem-solving situations. The Secretary's final words had been clear. Find a way to support innovation while maintaining necessary institutional controls. Back in the library, Grace noticed Brooks approaching through the windows and felt a surge of hope that he might have information about the review's progress. His expression was carefully neutral, but she had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated his emotional state. Any word from the Pentagon circus? Brooks asked, settling into a chair where he could observe both Grace and the headquarters building. Nothing yet, Dr. Scott replied, though the waiting is probably harder than whatever decision he makes. Brooks nodded understanding, his own military experience having taught him that uncertainty was often more stressful than negative outcomes. Grace, I want you to know that regardless of what happens with the official review, what you did was important and valuable. But important enough to change how the military thinks about getting help from people like me? Grace asked. That's the big question, Brooks acknowledged. Military organizations are designed to resist change because consistency and predictability save lives in combat situations, but they also have to be flexible enough to adapt when circumstances require new approaches. Eldona Williams studied Brooks with the appraising gaze of someone who had spent decades evaluating military personnel. Sergeant Brooks, you've been remarkably supportive of Grace throughout this process. Is that entirely because of your connection to her mother? Brooks considered the question seriously before answering. Mrs. Williams, your daughter saved my life, and I'll always be grateful for that. But my support for Grace is based on her demonstrated competence and the value of her contribution. She earned my respect through her own actions. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Specialist Ortiz, whose communications equipment was crackling with radio traffic from multiple sources. Excuse me, folks, but I thought you should know that Major General Hayes just received a call from the Secretary of the Army. Word is spreading through military networks that this review could establish new policies for how we handle civilian expertise. The knowledge that their local situation had attracted attention at the highest levels of military leadership added another dimension of pressure to an already complex situation. Grace's technical insight was no longer just about fixing one tank, or even preventing equipment failures at multiple bases. It was becoming a test case for institutional flexibility and innovation. No pressure or anything, Grace said, with a slight smile that reminded everyone present of her essential courage and humor, despite the stress she was experiencing. Brooks chuckled despite the tension. Grace, I've been in combat situations that felt less intense than waiting for bureaucrats to make decisions. Their conversation was interrupted by the appearance of Colonel Adams, who approached the library with the purposeful stride of someone carrying significant news. His expression was carefully controlled, but his body language suggested that the review's outcome was still uncertain. Grace, Adams said, Major General Hayes is ready to reconvene the review. He wants to speak with you privately before announcing his official findings. The request for a private conversation created both hope and anxiety among Grace's supporters. Such meetings could indicate either that Hayes wanted to provide personal encouragement before delivering bad news publicly, or that he was genuinely interested in understanding her perspective before making his final decision. Should I be worried? Grace asked, looking between Adams and Brooks for guidance. Just be yourself, Brooks advised. Answer his questions honestly, and don't try to be anything other than who you are. Dr. Scott stood to accompany Grace back to the headquarters building. Grace, remember that you've done nothing wrong. Major General Hayes may be evaluating procedures and policies, but your contribution was valuable regardless of what decisions he makes about the future. As they walked across the base toward what could be the most important conversation of Grace's young life, she found herself thinking about her mother's compass pendant and the values it represented. Rebecca Williams had faced her own challenges when people questioned her expertise and authority, but she had always remained true to her commitment to helping others, regardless of institutional obstacles. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Fort Valor parade grounds as Grace prepared to enter a meeting that would determine not just her own recognition, but potentially influence how military organizations approached innovation and unconventional expertise for years to come. Ready? Colonel Adams asked as they reached the headquarters building entrance. Grace touched her mother's compass one more time, drawing strength from the connection to someone who had faced similar challenges with courage and determination. Yes, sir, "I'm ready." Behind them, Brooks and the other personnel who had supported Grace throughout this remarkable day watched her disappear into the building that housed the institutional authority, which would either validate or condemn their decision. To listen to a 12-year-old's insight about military equipment. Whatever Major General Hayes decided, they had already witnessed something extraordinary. A young person who possessed both the technical knowledge and moral courage to speak up when she knew she could help solve problems that mattered. The waiting continued, but now it felt different. Instead of anxiety about an uncertain outcome, there was a sense of anticipation about whether institutional wisdom would prove flexible enough to recognize and support the kind of innovative thinking that Grace Williams represented. The next hour would determine whether the military was ready to expand its definition of expertise to include people who didn't fit conventional categories, but who possessed the knowledge and courage to make valuable contributions when they were needed most. Inside the headquarters building, Grace Williams prepared to make her case, not just for her own involvement in solving the tank problem, but for the broader principle that good ideas and sound reasoning deserved consideration regardless of their source. The conversation she was about to have would either open new possibilities for how military organizations approached problem solving, or close the door on unconventional approaches that challenged established hierarchies and procedures. Either way, she was ready to honor her mother's legacy by standing up for what she knew to be true. The private conference room in Fort Valor's headquarters building felt significantly more intimate than the formal briefing room where the morning's review had taken place. Major General Hayes had chosen this smaller space deliberately, creating an environment that would encourage honest conversation rather than institutional posturing. Grace Williams sat across from him at a simple table, her small stature emphasized by the military furnishings that surrounded them, but her posture reflecting the quiet confidence she had inherited from her mother. Hayes studied Grace with the kind of careful assessment that characterized his approach to complex personnel evaluations. During his phone conversations with Pentagon officials, he had received guidance that emphasized the strategic importance of finding solutions that supported both innovation and institutional stability. The Secretary of the Army had been particularly clear that this situation required nuanced thinking rather than rigid adherence to existing regulations. "Grace," Hayes began, his tone notably less formal than it had been during the morning review, "I want you to help me understand something that doesn't appear in any of the official reports I've reviewed." Grace nodded, uncertain what specific aspect of the situation he wanted to discuss, but committed to providing honest answers, regardless of their potential consequences. "According to the documentation, you identified a complex technical problem that had stumped experienced military mechanics for 3 weeks, Hayes continued. "But what I want to understand is why you felt it was appropriate to offer that analysis to people who outranked you in every conceivable way." The question struck at the heart of the institutional tension that had defined the entire controversy. Grace considered her response carefully, understanding that Hayes was asking about something more fundamental than technical competence or diagnostic procedures. "Sir, I didn't think about rank or authority when I saw that people needed help," Grace replied quietly. "My mom always taught me that when you have knowledge that could solve problems, you have a responsibility to share it, especially when other people might be affected if the problems don't get fixed." Hayes made notes on his legal pad, his expression remaining neutral as he processed her response. "And you didn't consider that your age and civilian status might make your involvement inappropriate?" "I considered it," Grace admitted. "But I also considered that the tank wasn't working properly, and I thought I might know why. It seemed more important to help solve the problem than to worry about whether I was supposed to be the one solving it." The simplicity of her moral reasoning impressed Hayes more than elaborate justifications might have. In his experience, the Best military personnel often demonstrated similar clarity about prioritizing mission accomplishment over procedural concerns when circumstances demanded adaptive thinking. Grace, do you understand that your diagnostic approach has now been implemented at nearly 50 military installations? Hayes asked. Grace's eyes widened slightly as she absorbed the scope of impact that had resulted from her observation about one tank's behavior. I knew it was affecting other bases, but I didn't realize it was that many. Your insight has prevented equipment failures that could have cost the military over $60 million and significantly impacted our training capabilities, Hayes continued. From a practical standpoint, your contribution has been extraordinarily valuable. Grace felt a mixture of pride and overwhelming responsibility as she realized the true magnitude of what had started as a simple suggestion about checking a thermal relay. Does that mean what I did was right? Hayes set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more thoughtful than analytical. Grace, that's exactly the question I'm here to answer, and it's more complicated than you might think. He stood and walked to the window overlooking the base, his posture suggesting that he was weighing factors that extended far beyond the immediate situation. Military organizations depend on structure, hierarchy, and established procedures because lives are at stake when equipment fails or decisions are made incorrectly. We can't have people making up their own rules about who's qualified to work on critical systems. Grace listened carefully, understanding that Hayes was explaining the institutional perspective that made her involvement problematic, despite its successful outcome. But, Hayes continued, turning back to face her, we also can't afford to ignore valuable expertise just because it comes from unexpected sources. Your technical analysis was sound, your reasoning was logical, and your results speak for themselves. The word "but" suggested that Hayes was moving toward a more nuanced assessment than the simple approval or condemnation that most people had expected. Grace found herself holding her breath as she waited for him to continue. Grace, I've spent the past hour on the phone with some very senior military officials, including the Secretary of the Army, Hayes said, returning to his seat. They're all asking the same question. How do we support the kind of innovative thinking you demonstrated while maintaining the institutional controls that keep our personnel and equipment safe? Grace considered this carefully before responding. Maybe the question isn't whether people like me should be allowed to help, but how to create better ways for people with knowledge to share it when it's needed. Her suggestion impressed Hayes with its sophisticated understanding of institutional dynamics. Explain what you mean by that. Well, Grace said, her confidence growing as she articulated ideas she had been developing throughout the day. Master, Chief O'Brien and Sergeant Brooks didn't just listen to what I said and do it. They evaluated my suggestion, tested it carefully, and made their own decisions about whether it made sense. Maybe the system should focus on how to evaluate ideas, rather than who's allowed to have them. Hayes found himself nodding as he recognized the wisdom in Grace's analysis. Military organizations did indeed need better mechanisms for identifying and utilizing expertise regardless of its source, while maintaining appropriate safeguards and decision-making authority. That's a very sophisticated way to think about institutional innovation, Hayes observed. Where did you learn to analyze organizational problems like that? From watching how my mom dealt with people who didn't think she belonged in her job, Grace replied. She said that the best way to change people's minds about what you could do was to focus on doing it really well and letting the results speak for themselves. The reference to Rebecca Williams brought another dimension to Hayes' evaluation of the situation. His background research had revealed the extent of her military service and the circumstances of her death, providing context for understanding how Grace had developed both her technical knowledge and her moral courage. Grace, I want you to know that I've reviewed your mother's service record, Hayes said gently. She was an exceptional soldier who saved many lives through her expertise and courage. Grace felt tears beginning to form as she realized that this powerful military official had taken the time to learn about her mother's service and sacrifice. Thank you, sir. She would want me to use what she taught me to help people. I believe she would, Hayes agreed. And I think she would also want you to understand the responsibility that comes with having knowledge that others need. Hayes returned to his notes, reviewing the key points from their conversation before making the decisions that would determine not just Grace's recognition, but potentially influence military policy for years to come. Grace, I'm going to ask you one final question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer, Hayes said. If you were in my position, knowing what you know about military procedures and the importance of maintaining proper authority, what would you decide about your involvement in this situation? The question challenged Grace to think beyond her own perspective and consider the broader institutional implications of recognizing unconventional expertise. She sat quietly for several minutes, her hand touching her mother's compass as she worked through the complex factors involved. Sir, I think I would try to find a way to support people who want to help while making sure that the people in charge still make the final decisions, Grace said finally. Maybe create ways for people with knowledge to share it with the people who have the authority to evaluate it and decide whether to use it. Hayes smiled for the first time since arriving at Fort Valor, recognizing that Grace had articulated exactly the kind of balanced approach that would satisfy both innovation and institutional control requirements. Grace, that's precisely the recommendation I'm going to make to the Secretary of the Army, Hayes said. Your involvement in solving the tank problem wasn't a violation of military procedure. It was an example of how our procedures need to evolve to better utilize available expertise. Grace felt a surge of relief and excitement as she realized that Hayes had decided to support rather than condemn her contribution to the tank repair. Does that mean I won't get anyone in trouble? It means that the people who supported you made sound decisions based on professional judgment, Hayes confirmed. And it means that we're going to use this situation as a model for developing better ways to identify and utilize technical expertise, regardless of its source. As their private conversation concluded, Grace understood that she had participated in something larger than solving a mechanical problem or even challenging military protocols. She had helped demonstrate that institutional strength came from adaptability rather than rigid adherence to established categories, and that recognizing valuable contributions required wisdom rather than simply following rules. Are you ready to hear my official findings? Hayes asked as he prepared to return to the formal review setting. Grace nodded, feeling both nervous and hopeful about what would happen when they rejoined the larger group. Yes, sir, I'm ready. Good, Hayes replied, standing and straightening his uniform in preparation for what would be a historic announcement about military innovation and institutional change. Because what we're about to do is going to influence how the armed forces approach unconventional problem-solving for many years to come. As they prepared to leave the private conference room, Grace realized that her mother's compass had guided her through more than just a difficult day. It had helped her navigate a situation that honored Rebecca Williams' legacy of service, while opening new possibilities for how military communities could recognize and support expertise that didn't fit traditional categories. The afternoon sun streamed through the headquarters building windows as Grace Williams prepared to learn whether her remarkable contribution to military problem-solving would be celebrated as a model for institutional innovation or remembered as an exception to normal procedures. Either way, she had already proven that courage, competence, and commitment to helping others were more important than age, rank, or formal credentials when it came to making valuable contributions to the communities that mattered most. The formal review session awaited, but Grace now understood that she had already achieved something significant. She had shown that the best way to honor her mother's memory was to use the knowledge and values Rebecca Williams had shared with her to help solve problems that mattered to the people who served alongside them. The formal conference room had filled beyond its normal capacity as word of Major General Hayes's impending announcement spread throughout Fort Valor. Personnel from across the base had found reasons to be present for what many understood would be a historic moment in military decision-making. Grace Williams entered the room between her father and Brooks, drawing strength from their supportive presence while trying to prepare mentally for whatever public statement Hayes would make about her involvement in the tank repair. General Taylor stood at attention as Hayes entered the room, her expression carefully neutral despite her obvious concern for the personnel under her command who had supported Grace's unconventional contribution to solving the equipment problem. Colonel Adams, Master Chief O'Brien, and the other military professionals who had participated in the diagnostic process arranged themselves according to protocol while maintaining the solidarity that had characterized their approach throughout the challenging day. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes began, his voice carrying the formal authority that characterized official military announcements, "I have completed my review of the events leading to the resolution of equipment problems at this installation and multiple others throughout our armed forces." The room fell silent, except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sounds of base operations continuing outside the headquarters building. Grace felt her heart beating faster as she realized that the next few minutes would determine how her contribution would be officially recognized and whether the people who had supported her would face consequences for their decisions. This investigation began with concerns about procedural compliance and civilian involvement in military maintenance operations. Hayes continued, consulting his notes while maintaining eye contact with various personnel throughout the room. "However, my evaluation has revealed that the situation represents something far more significant than a simple regulatory matter." Captain Hall shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his expression suggesting that he remained concerned about the precedent being established by recognizing unconventional approaches to military problem-solving. His isolation from the main group reflected his continued discomfort with institutional changes that challenged traditional hierarchies and established procedures. "Miss Grace Williams," Hayes said, directing his attention to her with an expression that had transformed from skepticism to genuine respect. "Your diagnostic analysis of the thermal relay problem has prevented equipment failures at 53 military installations involving over 170 tanks. The potential cost savings exceeds $75 million, not including the immeasurable value of maintaining training readiness and operational capability." Grace felt overwhelmed by the expanding scope of impact that had resulted from a simple observation about one tank's behavior. The knowledge that her insight had affected so many installations and prevented such significant problems made her understand the true weight of responsibility that came with technical knowledge. "Furthermore," Hayes continued, "your analytical approach has been adopted as standard protocol for identifying similar thermal management issues across our entire fleet of armored vehicles. The diagnostic procedures you suggested are now being implemented throughout the Army as part of our routine maintenance operations." Brooks watched Grace's reaction with a mixture of pride and protective concern, recognizing that she was absorbing the full magnitude of her contribution to military operations. His own experience had taught him that success often brought its own challenges, particularly when that success attracted attention from institutional authorities who might have different agendas than simple problem solving. The question before me, Hayes said, was whether to focus on the procedural concerns raised by civilian involvement in military maintenance, or to recognize the exceptional value of the contribution made and the sound judgment demonstrated by the personnel who supported it. Dr. Scott observed the proceedings with professional interest, noting how Hayes was carefully balancing institutional requirements with recognition of individual achievement. Military organizations faced constant tension between maintaining necessary structure and encouraging the kind of innovative thinking that Grace had demonstrated. After extensive consultation with senior military officials, including the Secretary of the Army, Hayes announced, "I am hereby recommending that this situation serve as a model for developing new protocols that better utilize technical expertise, regardless of its source, while maintaining appropriate oversight and decision-making authority." The announcement created a ripple of surprised murmurs throughout the conference room as personnel realized that Hayes was choosing innovation over regulatory compliance. Grace felt a surge of relief and excitement as she understood that her contribution was being celebrated rather than condemned. "Colonel Adams," Hayes continued, "your decision to investigate Miss Williams' diagnostic hypothesis demonstrated exactly the kind of adaptive leadership that our modern military requires. Your actions are hereby commended and will be used as a case study in command decision-making curricula." Adams straightened with obvious relief and satisfaction, understanding that his career would benefit rather than suffer from his choice to support Grace's unconventional contribution to solving the tank problem. "Master Chief O'Brien and Sergeant Brooks," Hayes said, "your technical evaluation and implementation of the diagnostic procedures showed exemplary professional judgment. Your willingness to assess ideas based on their merit rather than their source reflects the highest standards of military expertise." O'Brien and Brooks exchanged glances that reflected their shared satisfaction with the official recognition of their decision-making process. Both men had understood the career risks involved in supporting Grace, but their professional instincts had proved correct. "General Taylor," Hayes said, addressing the base commander directly, "your leadership in managing this complex situation while maintaining focus on mission accomplishment deserves particular recognition. Fort Valor has become a model for how military installations should approach institutional innovation." General Taylor's expression showed both relief and professional pride as she realized that her support for unconventional problem-solving approaches had been validated at the highest levels of military leadership. Hayes turned his attention back to Grace, his tone becoming more personal despite the formal setting. "Miss Williams, your contribution to military readiness extends far beyond the technical problem you helped solve. You have demonstrated that expertise, analytical thinking, and commitment to service are more important than age, rank, or formal credentials when it comes to making valuable contributions to our mission." Grace felt tears of gratitude and emotional exhaustion beginning to flow as she absorbed the official recognition of her efforts and the knowledge that none of the people who had supported her would face negative consequences for their decisions. However, Hayes added with a slight smile, "We cannot have 12-year-olds wandering through maintenance bays offering technical advice without appropriate oversight and coordination." The comment drew chuckles from throughout the room, as everyone present recognized both the humor and the practical reality of Grace's unique situation. "Therefore," Hayes announced, "I am recommending the establishment of a new program that will identify and nurture exceptional technical talent in military families, providing appropriate educational opportunities and structured ways for young people with remarkable abilities to contribute to our mission as they develop their expertise." The announcement of a formal program that would create opportunities for other young people with technical talents represented a transformation of Grace's individual achievement into institutional change that could benefit military families for years to come. Sergeant Ramirez spoke up from her position in the room, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed institutional progress. "Sir, what would this program be called?" Hayes consulted his notes briefly before answering. "The Rebecca Williams Memorial Program for Technical Excellence will provide educational support and structured mentorship opportunities for military family members who demonstrate exceptional aptitude in technical fields." The naming of the program after Grace's mother created another moment of emotional intensity, as everyone present understood the profound way that Rebecca Williams's legacy was being honored through her daughter's achievement. Grace felt overwhelmed by the recognition of her mother's service and the knowledge that other military families would benefit from opportunities created in her memory. James Williams found his voice for the first time since the formal announcement began. "Major General Hayes, my family is deeply honored by this recognition of my wife's service and my daughter's contribution." "Mr. Williams," Hayes replied, "your family has embodied the best values of military service through multiple generations. It's appropriate that we recognize those contributions and create opportunities for others to follow similar paths." Eleanor Williams wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her granddaughter receive official recognition for achievements that honored both her own abilities and her mother's memory. The establishment of a formal program that would help other military families represented exactly the kind of legacy that Rebecca Williams would have wanted. "Grace," Hayes said, returning his attention to her directly, "do you have any questions about what we've discussed today?" Grace stood up carefully, her composure reflecting the strength she had drawn from her mother's example throughout this challenging experience. "Sir, I just want to make sure that other kids who have ideas about solving problems will have people who listen to them." "That's exactly what this program is designed to ensure," Hayes confirmed. "Your experience today has shown us that we need better ways to recognize and support technical expertise wherever it appears." As the formal review concluded, Grace found herself surrounded by the military personnel who had supported her throughout the day. Their shared satisfaction with the outcome reflected not just relief at avoiding negative consequences, but genuine pride in having participated in institutional change that would benefit military communities for years to come. Brooks approached Grace with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal gratitude. "Grace, your mother would be incredibly proud of what you accomplished today. You've honored her memory by using the knowledge she shared with you to help people. And you've made sure that other young people will have opportunities to do the same thing," Dr. Scott added, recognizing the broader significance of the program. That would be established in Rebecca Williams' name. 3 months later, Grace Williams stood in the newly established Rebecca Williams Memorial Technical Center at Fort Valor, watching a group of military family members work on diagnostic problems under the supervision of qualified instructors. The program that had emerged from her involvement in fixing one tank had grown into a comprehensive educational initiative that provided opportunities for young people with technical talents to develop their abilities while contributing to military missions. The center itself occupied a modern facility that combined classroom instruction with hands-on laboratories where students could work on real equipment under appropriate supervision. Grace served as both a student in the program and an informal mentor to other participants, sharing the analytical approaches her mother had taught her while continuing to develop her own expertise. Brooks visited the center regularly in his role as one of the program's advisory board members, his presence providing a living connection to Rebecca Williams' military service and sacrifice. His support for Grace had evolved into a broader commitment to ensuring that the program honored both technical excellence and the values of service that defined military communities. How does it feel to see your idea turned into something this substantial? Brooks asked Grace as they watched students work on a complex engine diagnostic problem. Grace considered the question while observing a 10-year-old successfully identify a fuel injection issue that had puzzled older students. "It feels like Mom's compass finally brought me to where I was supposed to be." The center's walls displayed photographs and service records of military family members who had made significant technical contributions, with Rebecca Williams' portrait holding a place of honor near the entrance. Her example of courage, competence, and commitment to helping others had become the standard that all program participants were encouraged to emulate. General Taylor appeared in the laboratory doorway, her regular visits to the center reflecting her continued support for the innovative approaches to military education and family engagement that had emerged from Grace's remarkable day. "Grace," General Taylor said, "I wanted you to know that we've received requests from 12 other military installations to establish similar programs. Your contribution is having impact far beyond Fort Valor." Grace smiled while continuing to work on the diagnostic problem she was helping another student solve. "That's good, General. There are probably lots of kids who have ideas about fixing things if someone will listen to them." As the Arizona sun set over Fort Valor, Grace Williams understood that she had achieved something more significant than solving a mechanical problem or even changing military procedures. She had proven that the values her mother had lived and died for, courage, competence, and commitment to serving others, could continue to make a difference through future generations who were willing to use their knowledge to help people when help was needed. The thermal relay that had started everything still sat in a display case in the technical center, labeled as the component that had catalyzed institutional change and demonstrated the importance of listening to expertise regardless of its source. But for Grace, the most important outcome wasn't the recognition or the program that bore her mother's name. It was the knowledge that she had honored Rebecca Williams' legacy by using what she had been taught to help solve problems that mattered to the people who served alongside them. The tank that had brought them all together was back in service, performing its role in training exercises that prepared soldiers for missions that would protect the country Rebecca Williams had died defending. And somewhere in the Arizona desert, carried by a compass that had belonged to a combat engineer who understood that helping people was the most important thing anyone could do, her daughter continued the work of using knowledge and courage to make the world a little safer for everyone who depended on military personnel to keep them protected. The story of the mechanic's daughter who fixed a SEAL's tank engine had become something larger than anyone had imagined. Proof that the best way to honor those who had served was to ensure that their values and knowledge continued to help solve the problems that future generations would face. Grace Williams had learned that lesson well, and she was already teaching it to others who would carry it forward long after she had grown up and found her own ways to serve. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.